We're ready for our practical demonstration on how to determine a correct exposure. Before we do that, we have to discuss different camera modes because that'll of course affect our exposure. Now, you've probably bought your first camera, maybe you're actually an experienced professional, but the first time you picked up that camera, you actually noticed a few different settings. Now, of course, we have auto, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. Now, auto is quite seductive because it's usually green on the dial and basically the camera does all the thinking for you. My suggestion is don't do that because you probably would have noticed that the first time you use your camera on holiday, photographing your pets, family, whatever it may be, it's a little bit weird and the exposures are all out of the place. Perhaps it's blurry. There's all these things that can go wrong. The camera is only a tool. It can't do the thinking for you. It does a lot of the thinking for you, but you've got to actually use it properly. So now, program. Do we use program in a professional environment? My encouragement to you is do not use program because there's going to be a lot of things that you need to change based upon the genre in which you're photographing. Now that gives us three modes left. We have shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. Well, shutter priority might work for people who do different kind of sports, for example. You might be photographing the tennis and you know that you have to be at a certain speed to photograph tennis, or the football, or it could be car racing. Well, you know that it has to be at 2,000 speed, at a fraction of a second, or 8,000th of a second. Well, that's fine, great. I'm telling you, if you're photographing people though, then you actually arguably would only ever use two modes. And I'm saying to you, I would rather you only use one of them. And you probably know what mode that is. Well, aperture priority, for example, we understand what aperture priority is. We're prioritizing the aperture that we want, of course, which will determine how many things are in focus, and we call that depth of field. So if you want more things in focus, I think of you've probably heard of f-stops, right? So you've got f-stop like say 1.2, 1.8, 2.8, f4, 5.6, and so on. The confusing part about it is that if you go to f1.2 or 1.4, it's wide open. And you think, well, wait a second, is this more or less things in focus because of it? I want you to actually think about it this way. If it's f1.2, it's a small number. Yes, it's a big aperture. If it's a small number, it means less things are in focus. As it goes to 2.8, f4, 5.6, f8, there's going to be more things in focus. So think of it like that. More things in focus, the higher the f number, the more things in focus. Fantastic. So that's aperture priority. Now we prioritize the aperture. And then, of course, in that mode, we can prioritize the ISO that we want, but then the camera will choose the appropriate speed. Now, the problem is that, of course, the speed might not be the one that you need. It might be too slow. You might get blur, and there's all things that can go wrong. And yes, of course, as we talk about the golden triangle, or at least the triangle of exposure, we have ISO, we have shutter speed, and we have aperture. Yes, we can actually have any of these things on automatic. Shutter priority, aperture priority. We can even have auto ISO. I strongly discourage you letting the camera doing the thinking for you, especially if you're photographing people, let alone in an environment that doesn't change. As in, if you're photographing me now, for example, it's quite predictable. Here's the exposure, fantastic. The minute you start to widen your angle of view, your exposure will change based upon the values within that frame. Now, we'll discuss this further a little bit in a moment. Now, if you photograph on manual, you're choosing everything, and arguably it's more difficult, no different than driving an automatic car and then driving a manual car. Yes, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, you're going to do more things, but you can take control more. Now, what we're doing right now is I'm going to photograph a white piece of board. It's nothing exciting at this stage, but I want to emulate a pale-skinned bride wearing a white dress laying on a white wall, or a polar bear in a snowstorm. And let's see how aperture priority handles this environment. So right now, I am on aperture priority. I am at 3200 of a second, f2.8, 400 ISO. Now, it's a white board, and I've actually had to focus on a cut in the board because, of course, it's nondescript. It'll be very hard to focus. So right now, although I'm actually physically seeing a white board, in my camera, if you were to photograph something white, it's going to underexpose it. It's going to make it gray. You have to understand that the camera is not racist. It's actually going to pick something in between. It doesn't care about black. It doesn't care about white. Whatever tones the camera sees, it's going to make it mid-gray. It has to have a standard. It's not going to be polarizingly white or black. It's going to be mid-gray. So what happens is the camera is going to evaluate what's in the scene and then determine what it believes to be a correct exposure. why aperture priority doesn't work, and we'll talk about metering modes in a moment. But at the moment, we're actually using matrix and evaluative metering. We're evaluating the entire frame, and now we are underexposing badly. Now, you'd think sort of almost the opposite. Now, if you sort of see something white, you think, oh my God, I'm photographing something white now, I should underexpose this. Well, the camera is already doing that for you. It's counterintuitive. You have to think about it. If something is light, bright, white, you have to overexpose. And I say that in inverted commas because you're not overexposing, you're exposing correctly, but you have to understand what the camera is doing and thinking. So let's go back to this now. What we have to do now is I'm going to switch the camera to manual and emulate the exact same settings. Now, yes, I can use compensation, exposure compensation. This is basically where I can leave it on aperture priority and compensate with the exposure, but that will get that value from the shutter speed. I would rather determine where I want that particular value to come out of. Does that make any sense? So in this case, I am going to emulate the exact same exposure. I'm going to go 3200 of a second, 2.8, 400 ISO. So let me do that. 3200 and 2.8 and 400 ISO. Great, so we're seeing the exact same thing. Now, what did we say? If your subject matter is bright, you go bright, lean towards the plus, and if your subject is dark, you go dark, lean towards the minus. Now, what do I mean when I'm saying that? Well, if you look in your camera, in your viewfinder, most cameras, of course, will have a exposure meter in the actual viewfinder. Now, here we have a plus, minus, and a 0. 0 represents what the camera thinks a good exposure is, plus represents overexposed, minus represents underexposed. So what I have to do now is this. I have to deliberately overexpose, as in expose correctly, because that's the exposure that I want, but overexpose by what the camera is saying to make this white card look white. So now I have latitude and room to breathe in my shutter speed. And from experience, I believe we're going to be about 5 to 6 clicks. And when I say clicks, I mean third stop increments towards the plus sign. So in your exposure triangle, you have ISO, you have aperture, and you have shutter speed. You can use 1, 2, or 3 of these combinations to click towards the plus sign. So in this case, I am going to click once, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now I've determined that something white is going to be about 2 stops, as in there's 6 third stop increments. A third is 1 stop, and then third is 2 stops. So now we've got 2 stops difference from the original. So if you shot aperture priority with a polar bear in a snowstorm, you would have underexposed all of those shots. And that's going to be a problem. And the minute you start introducing different elements other than white, again, your exposures change again. So all I know now is, and what you know, anything white, and if you cover up your camera and your meter, depending on whether you're spot metering or your evaluative metering, matrix metering, which we'll discuss shortly, you need to overexpose by what the camera is saying by 2 stops. Okay, fantastic. So we've got that. Now, what happens when we actually we switch this to black? Now, we'll do that shortly, but what I want to discuss with you is this. Once you determine a correct exposure, if you want more or less things in focus, you can't just move one thing. Because right now, I'm on manual, I'm at 800th of a second, f2.8, 400 ISO. Now, I'm shooting with an 85mm 1.8 lens. So if I want, now of course it doesn't matter because I've just got a white background here, but if I had subject matter in front of me, foreground, background, middle ground, and I wanted to choose, let's say, an aperture of maybe f2, well, you can see how now I've overexposed this by 1 stop, which means that I have to actually bring that value down either with my shutter speed or my ISO or both. So let's go back to where we were. I'm at 800th of a second, f2.8 and 400 ISO. But we might say, well, wait a second, I can get more quality out of this photograph, which means that ISO affects quality. Let me now actually go to 200 ISO, and let's go 3 clicks down. So now I have 400th of a second at f2.8 and 200 ISO. Both of those were correct exposures. This one, I get better quality, and I have a safe handheld speed. It really only changes really dramatically when you're looking at different f-stops, as in how many things you want in focus. If you can get better quality, why wouldn't you? But certainly, depending on how many things you want in focus, you want to change that. So remember, once you determine the correct exposure, you change one more thing, you've got to change 2 or 3 things of that exposure triangle. So now that we've determined what will happen to a white subject matter, what will happen now when we look at black subject matter? Let's do it. So now we have black subject matter. It could be likened to maybe 4 African American men wearing a black suit leaning on a black wall. If you were shooting aperture priority, then I think you know already what's going to happen. So if I'm going to look in the camera right now, I'm seeing a black piece of card and I'm shooting aperture priority. It's 1/25th of a second, 2.8, 400 ISO, and it's a terrible exposure. What is black is now mid-gray. It's terrible. You've just underexposed, you've just overexposed this shot ridiculously. Now, if we thought something white was actually, with 2 stops, we proved that we need to overexpose to get a correct exposure. What did we say? If something is bright, you go bright, lean towards the plus sign. Now, if something is black, let's do the opposite. If something is black, let's go dark, let's go black, lean towards the minus, with 1, 2, or 3 of the things that affect our exposure, either with the ISO, the shutter speed, or the aperture. So in this case, what I'm going to do now is, I'm seeing something grey, I'm going to flick my camera mode to manual, and I'm getting the exact same exposure. What is black is actually grey. So I'm going to move my shutter speed dial, because I'm actually quite happy with 400 ISO, quite happy with 2.8 in the context of this demonstration. And now I'm actually going to underexpose by about 5 clicks, as in 5 third stop increments, which is equal to 1 2/3 of a stop. So let's count the clicks. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's have a look at that. I would say we can even go 1 more, which is the equivalent. So now I am seeing something black. So guess what we've just proven? We have proven that white and black accordingly will actually over and underexpose by 2 stops. Now that you know that, now you look at your subject matter in a bit of a different way and learn how each of those values will change based upon introducing new elements. For example, now we have something black. What happens if we added maybe 1/3 of the frame with a white dress and maybe Caucasian skin? What will happen then? There's all these things we have to determine, but now that we've determined 2 stops will be under and overexposed respectively with black and white, now let's look at the nuances when we start to add some different subject matter in the frame. So we determined what we believe to be a correct exposure based upon a completely black scene. Now, yes, of course, if you start adding skin tones and white dresses and things like that, it may change. And yes, of course, too, if you're photographing with mirrorless, what you see is what you get. What we're trying to do now is determine what we believe to be a correct exposure and what's the quickest way of getting there and what's going to be the most efficient way. Now, I didn't change my exposure whatsoever. Once I determined what I believed was black, and I had a feeling it was a little bit light, but now I've actually introduced Sally, our mannequin, and if you look at her, you would say she's exposed correctly. We see detail in her skin tone, per se. And we see detail and creases in the white. I still feel that maybe we're a touch over. So what I'm going to do now is go 1 click down, and now you can start to see the shadow underneath her bust and a bit more detail. So we're about a 1/3 stop out. Of course, if I had skin tone, skin and white dress in my scene, it would have been more obvious. But I was about a 1/3 stop out. So now we're looking at that as well. We're looking good. So guess what? Now I can actually photograph my entire scene in this environment. When I start to introduce new elements in this shot, in other words, if I widen my angle of view, I have less white, I have more black, and so on and so forth. Now let me explain in more detail what that means. Right now, the camera originally was evaluating the actual entire scene. So with different camera systems, it's either called matrix metering or evaluative metering. We're evaluating the entire scene. If we look at our exposure meter now, look at it. We're only, by what the camera is saying, it's saying that we're only overexposing this shot by 1 click. Now, why is that? Whereas when we took her out, it was actually it thought it was the correct exposure, but what did we say? If something is dark, you lean towards the dark and you underexpose. So we lean towards the minus, but now we're looking at what the camera thinks is actually a correct exposure, or about 1/3 stop out. It's because we've introduced skin tone, we've introduced white. So you could confidently say that if you were photographing subject matter like this, and you had some black, you had some white, and you had some skin tone, it's close to mid-gray. And that's why aperture priority in this case would work. But watch what happens now when we change to the different metering modes. So let's do this. We're going to go into our camera settings. And right now, as you can see, we're on matrix metering, which is evaluative. Now, there's center weighted. I discourage center weighted metering because basically it's going to evaluate the entire scene, but then focus on what's in front of us in the middle of the frame, as in it's weighted, it's biased to the center. If it's biased to the center, if you add that white dress and add that skin tone, it's going to be brighter than mid-gray. The camera's going to make it mid-gray, therefore underexpose this. So center weighted is not a good one at all. Now, some people like the idea of spot metering, but this is what's going to happen. If we spot meter, and let's go to aperture priority now, and let's see what happens. Okay, so you see what happens that if we go down to her chest, now what's happening? It's exactly what happened before. When we had the white piece of card, it was all white, and the camera says, I don't like white, I want to make it mid-gray. So if you spot for a white dress, and you just leave it at that, and you do an exposure lock, you're going to underexpose. Now, if we know that shooting something white, we have to overexpose by about 5 to 6 clicks, almost 2 stops, then we know that we could spot for the dress. So now I'm going to emulate this exact exposure with manual, 2500 speed, 2.8 400. Okay, so this is exactly like what our spot meter did. And like I said, it's a problem. Let's see if our theory works. So what we need to do now is, because we have some latitude in our speed, I'm going to lean towards the plus sign, 5 to 6 clicks. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to stay there. So it's 1 2/3. So it's 5 clicks. And guess what? We've got a great exposure. Which basically means that you could spot for a white dress, the highlight on the white dress, and then you know you're going to be 1 2/3 stops to the plus. Great. Now let's see what happens if we actually spot for the black in the environment. Look what just happened. The whole frame changed. You can see it's actually changing with everything that I'm doing. Guess what happened again? We see, the camera sees black. It's actually going to meter for that spot where my focus point is, and it sees something black. It's going to make it mid-gray, which it has. And of course, all the dress, the skin tone blows out completely. That's terrible. So what do we want to do? We are going to underexpose 5 clicks. Great, let's do that. We're exposing correctly by what the camera is saying. So let's do this. Now, right now, let's emulate what we're doing in aperture priority. We're at 200 to 2.8, 400. (200, 2.8, 400). So what we're going to do now is we are going to move the shutter speed 5 clicks. And guess what? We arrived at the exact same destination. So let's now spot meter for the skin, and let's see what happens. So right now, there's many places that I could choose, but she's a mannequin, obviously different properties than normal skin. But what I've done is I've chosen a highlight on her arm that's closest to the light source. So what we need to know, from experience, that I know that most of our skin tones are going to be about 2 clicks, as in 2/3 of a stop, brighter than mid-gray. So what's going to happen is the camera will see brighter than mid-gray, go to mid-gray, as in underexposed, which is what you're seeing right now, which means usually you can actually overexpose by 2/3 stops. Remember, we're not overexposing, we're exposing correctly, but only overexposing what the camera is saying. So I'm going to emulate the exposure that the camera has given us on manuals. At the moment, it's aperture priority, 2000, 2.8, 400 ISO. So let's do that. Let's go. 2000, 2.8, 400 ISO. And again, the camera thinks it's a good exposure because we've got the actual exposure meter right on 0, but we know we're actually looking at a bad exposure. So what I'm going to do now, using my shutter speed, is going to go a couple clicks. In this case, I'm thinking 3, and there we've got a good exposure. We're one stop different. So again, depending on different skin types, whether it's Caucasian skin, African American, tan skin, it's going to be different all the time. And the thing is, depending on where you put your spot meter, again, it'll change. We've just worked out how we can spot meter for a dress. We've learnt how we can spot for a dark suit, let's say, to emulate a dark suit. And now we're emulating arguably spot metering for the skin, but there is no standard per se. There is this white is white, black is black, but skin tones will vary. So again, just let's go to aperture priority and once again, look at those differences there. And we go from white